next 15 minutes or so, I'll be offering a rundown of the recently published policy paper Sophia Kolendaya co-authored under the auspices of the Counter Extremism Project and the Konrad Adenauer Center, to whom I'd like to offer my thanks and gratitude as well. We'll essentially be talking about, over the next 20 minutes, Sophie and I, about the linkages of terrorist groups in West Africa with terrorist networks in other African regions. And I'll begin by just offering a condensed summary, essentially, of the findings of our recently published policy paper, and then I'll hand over to Sophia, who'll then offer another rundown of our proposed recommendations, essentially. Next slide, please. In our policy paper, we essentially summarize the current state of affairs regarding the linkages of terrorist groups in West Africa, some of which the previous presenter, Theo, very eloquently touched on, the JNIM, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, and of course the Islamic State West Africa province, ISWAP, with other terrorist networks across Africa, and will also be providing recommendations for policymakers and security agencies. In particular, JNIM and the ISGS have demonstrated that they possess the intention and capability of regional expansion across West Africa. But as we mentioned in our paper, there is, however, no indication of either JNIM or ISGS forming a trans-regional linkage with terrorist groups in other African subregions, at least not in the foreseeable future. We do, however, say that terrorist groups in West Africa are pragmatic in their approach to collaborations, and that their choice of network linkages is guided by local dynamics and their own particular agenda, which is far more prominent as a driver, more so than ideological considerations. Next slide, please. So I'd like to just begin by briefly just touching on some of the socioeconomic factors, or by just giving an overview of the socioeconomic terrain in West Africa and how that sort of shaped the way terrorism looks in the region, in a manner of speaking. And so we'll see that for those of us who are observant, or who are quite interested in the sub-region, in the West African sub-region, we'll see that over the last 5 years or so, there's been a gradual shift from the Sahel region in Northwest Africa, further southwards towards the Gulf of Guinea states, by which I mean Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and of course parts of Togo, Benin, and even the border regions of Ghana. And so what this tells us is that there's definitely a shift in pattern, not just in the modes of attack, the mode rather of attacks used by terrorist organizations in terms of asymmetrical warfare and things like that, but there are other shifts as well taking place in terms of collaborations, alliances, and economic, socioeconomic factors as well, and considerations at play, basically, particularly by these terrorist organizations. And in our paper, we focus on the three most active terrorist organizations in the West African sub-region, such as the Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wa al-Muslimin, that is JNIM, and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, and ISWAP. And we see from our studies of these of the three respective terrorist organizations that there is an indication of expanding their network outreach in West Africa. And JNIM and ISGS have shown the most interest in expanding their network outreach in the region of the three aforementioned groups. And so this calls for a consideration of wider trans-regional linkages of these terrorist groups with other terrorist networks operational in North, Central, and East Africa, just to see what their potentialities are, which of course will then help policymakers and others who share an interest in not just West Africa, but also in the wider African continent, to see how we can tweak policies to reflect these potentials, these potentialities for trans-regional linkages amongst terrorist organizations. Next slide, please. This is essentially just a summary. As I said, in our brief, we underlined the driving factors for terrorist groups in West Africa, the specificities of some of the groups, and the linkages between the different networks and terrorist groups. Next slide, please. So what are some of the driving factors for terrorist groups in West Africa? Our findings have revealed that one of these factors is economic instability and military coups. The other is economic marginalization, and another is globalization and the spread of extremist ideology. If you look at the countries in the Sahel where the JNIM and the ISGS have been most active over the last 5 years, we're talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Niger. There's Guinea, I mustn't forget to mention. The one commonality that these countries have is economic instability, particularly military coups. And that's one factor that's sort of helped to drive the relative success of terrorist organizations in terms of spreading their tentacles across the Sahel. Economic marginalization as well is another factor. As we'll touch on later in our paper, we'll see that these active terrorist organizations have been able to capitalize on the marginalization of particular ethno-religious or ethno-linguistic groups, such as the Pule or the Fulani in these Sahelian countries, essentially to spread their networks and to also recruit essentially amongst these ethnic groups. Then, of course, there's also globalization and the spread of extremist ideology. We see as with the advent of the emergence rather of Al-Qaeda, and of course the more recent advent of ISIS, nation states, ethnic groups do not exist in bubbles. They're not secluded from the rest of the world, and that extremist ideologies have been able to spread beyond the geographical regions where they begun, thanks, of course, to technology, the advent of modern day technology. Next slide, please. And so this leads to the next, offers the perfect segue for looking into what the specificities are of ISWAP, JNIM, and ISGS. Now, with ISWAP, we'll see that ISWAP is mostly active in the Lake Chad Basin, which is made up of Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. And so ISWAP's core membership comes from these 4 countries. And so on the one hand, it is transnational in that it's been able to draw its members from the 4 aforementioned countries, but so far it's not shown itself to be trans-regional. essentially, and this is this is unlike JNIM and ISGS. Unlike ISWAP, JNIM and ISGS have demonstrated that they both possess the intention and capability of regional expansion beyond or across West Africa. With JNIM and ISGS, they've capitalized on local rivalries and grievances against the state to gain the support of local populations, which I alluded to earlier, in their respective territories. They've been able to draw on rivalries between for example, the Pure ethnic group and the Dogon ethnic group, and that's helped to just swell their numbers. Next slide, please. Based based on existing debates on local, global, and what some researchers have termed global linkages among terrorist groups in Africa, it's important to also consider existing frameworks for understanding the emergence of terrorist networks. So I'll briefly touch on the prominent tendencies, essentially, in studying and analyzing the linkages amongst terrorist groups, not just in West Africa, but across Africa. The two most prominent ones are the localist and the globalist approaches. And very crudely, for lack of a better word, the localist approach is essentially adopted by researchers who hold the position, rather, that in order to better understand all of these respective terrorist organizations, we need to focus on the local factors, on the local dynamics, on the local sociological, economic, cultural, linguistic factors that drive their ability their emergence and the ability to recruit members. Whereas on the other hand, you have the globalists who say that we need to adopt a more macro approach, that is, we need to look at how their connections to other trans-regional, transnational, transcontinental, more pertinently, terrorist organizations such as Al Qaeda and ISIS, and somewhere in the middle you then have the global tendency, which says we should actually try to bring the two together to try to adopt a much more nuanced approach to understanding terrorist organizations. Next slide, please. And so over the next 2 to 3 minutes, I'd like to touch on the potential for transregional networks in North, Central, East, and Southern Africa. I'll be looking at North Africa, West Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, after which I'll then hand over to my co-author, Sophia. Next slide, please. To understand better the linkages of terrorist groups across Africa and Africa's sub-regions, I think it's important to look at, first of all, money, by which we mean transnational organized crime, how also terrorist groups finance their activities, the training as well of training of fighters and foreign terrorist fighters, and lastly, weapon smuggling and the use of small arms and light weapons. Next slide, please. I'd like to then, thank you. I'd like to first of all touch on transnational organized crime, such as TNOC. From our studies, what we've found out is that what all of the terrorist organizations, not just only the active ones in West Africa, but across Africa, what they have in common is that they are all, each of them are involved in transnational organized crime, by which we mean that they're involved in illicit activities to finance their activities, which lets us know that these are not they're pragmatic groups. They're not naive. These are not groups that focus on just ideology. For example, we see with GNIM that they're involved in the trafficking of contraband products, of narcotics, of cigarettes, and things like that across West Africa and the Sahel. We see the same thing with the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. We also see with Islamic State West Africa Province that they're also involved in not only in benefiting from the civil war in Libya and the smuggling of small arms and light weapons across the region, but also that they've taken advantage of their control of the Lake Chad territory to engage in controlling the trading across the Lake Chad's waters as well. And so that's one commonality that the GNIM, the ISGS, and ISWAP have. But then we see also that in East Africa and Southern Africa, that the Islamic State, Mozambique, also has taken advantage of illicit trafficking, which was previously controlled by drug barons in East Africa, to get involved in that trade between Mozambique and neighboring countries in Southern Africa and East Africa. And so on the one hand, we do see that there is that sort of connection in terms of transnational organized crime, but we haven't seen evidence to show that there's the potential for a connection between Islamic State Mozambique and, say, for example, the ADF, the Allied Democratic Force that operates in Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo in terms of a collaboration. And lastly, I'd like to touch on the training of foreign fighters and funding. What we've also seen from available reports and evidence and fieldwork, that there have been individuals in countries such as Nigeria, Senegal, who have traveled from those countries to join up with ISIS in Syria, to join the jihadists there, and that there have been also individuals and fighters who have gone from other West African countries to other West African countries, or to other countries in North Africa for training or to join fighters over there, and vice versa. But we have not seen evidence of that happening on a huge scale to suggest a collaboration. We've also seen evidence shows that there is a connection between the ISGS, the GNIM, and ISWAP with ISIS in terms of sharing of information. The ISIS periodical magazine, the Al-Naba, constantly makes references to the activities of these three groups. It also mentions, it provides information on their activities, which leads us to know that there is definitely some level of information sharing, but it doesn't show that there is an intricate, and it doesn't evidence an intricate level of collaboration as yet between them. And lastly, in a way, while on the one hand this evidences, we've seen evidence of a shift in pattern in terms of collaboration to some degree between the ISGS, the GNIM, and ISWAP with ISIS as sort of the greater canopy or franchise of sorts. There's also evidence that ISGS and GNIM are potentially in or already in conflict with each other in terms of a competition for geographical terrain and also for resources as well, which has become a great incentive driving these groups more so than ideological considerations. So that's also something to to watch out for, the competition amongst the terrorist groups. We see this as well with ISWAP as well, and the fragmentation of this group in the Lake Chad Basin as well. I think that's a good place for me to end my presentation, and I'll hand over now to Sophia, who will then talk us through our recommendations. Thank you for your time.